Hello. Welcome to the Kansas City Public Library. We're getting ready to get started, but there's a few housekeeping tasks I wanted to let you know about. I'm Carrie Coogan. I'm the new Director of Public Affairs for the library, and I want to thank you all so much for coming today. Thank you. Thank you. So I wanted to let you know that the book is available for sale, and you can purchase it here, courtesy of our partners at Rainy Day Books and Vivian Jennings. They're wonderful partners, and we're happy to have them here tonight. Also, book signing will take place after the event up here on stage, and the line will form to the left, starting right here. So please line up this way, right over here, and then the book signing will actually happen right up here. After the presentation as well, we will have time for some questions, probably about 15 minutes worth of questions, and we'll have a microphone set up right here and also right down here. We just ask that you please ask a question, no statements or yeah. Lectures, good. Really just ask a question and then we can get through more questions as well, so we would really appreciate that. Okay, finally, again, thanks so much for being here and supporting this event tonight and all the events here at the Kansas City Public Library. But I also want you to know that the library does a lot of things in the community: programs, services. We have many partners, and so we just wanted to give you a quick look of some of the other wonderful things that the Kansas City Public Library does in the entire community. Thank you.
Reading is foundational. Anything you want to do in the modern world, you have to be reading is foundational. Anything you want to do in the modern world, you have to be able to read first. The library's mission is to build everything we do around reading.
What we've been able to do through the library, and with all the fathers here, we've noticed this, we've turned reading, it's not a chore, it's something, a fun activity to do.
What really excites me is seeing a child read a great book. See a child on her own, pull out of the stacks a great book, a book that I loved once, and watch that child absorbed in a book.
You can come here with your kids. I encourage any family and friends to come here to get involved.
But so is heritage and history. Robert Reich tonight will be talking about inequality and ownership and power, and we believe that everyone can inherit, own, and be empowered by our community's history, our great history in this community. To that end, we created our Meet the Past program with KCPT. And last year, after 5 nominations, we finally won an Emmy for our program thank you. The program was about Tom Bass, the great African-American horseman and trainer who sold horses to every president from Benjamin Harrison to Calvin Coolidge. There were some important presidents in the middle there. And then on Saturday night, Chepto Kosatan Buckner, our deputy director, walked down the runway in St. Louis and picked up another Emmy for our documentary, our Meet the Past on Zora Neale Hurston. So there's number 2. Tonight, we're very honored to have the former Secretary of Labor, Robert Reich. Some of you are probably wondering, those of you who know my political points of view, if I would be injecting that tonight. No, I won't. I already did that last week when Bob Lighton was here talking about his book, $1 Trillion Economists. Of course, the same day he was fired by the Brookings Institution after Elizabeth Warren wrote a 4-page letter about him, but I don't think it had anything to do with me or the library. In fact, tonight I'm not going to inject my political opinions other than to say that I agree with Robert Reich. First, I want to point out, thank you. In the book, this eloquent book, Saving Capitalism, he positively mentions Ted Cruz and Rand Paul. And seriously, and there is a sense that he talks about in the book that the libertarian right and the populist left are coming together around the issue that is, I think, central to saving capitalism, that of the corruption of corporate welfare and crony capitalism. And I agree with them that whatever the reasons for growing inequality in the United States and the world, the part played by giving welfare to the wealthiest corporations and individuals is just wrong. And I'm glad that he's here in Kansas City because in many ways we're the epicenter of that kind of crony capitalism and corporate welfare. Our entire economic development policy in Kansas City, particularly on the Missouri side, is based on that. I won't go into any detail about that. Some of you have already heard it, but if you want to enlist in the crusade that Robert Reich is all about, which is a populist crusade to change that, see me later. I also want to say that regardless of whether you disagree or agree with him, this man knows how to talk and to write. You'll find no better educated mind or a book that, for instance, features both Meg Whitman and Walt Whitman in the same chapter. Tonight, I do want you to know that the Secretary is being covered by 2 documentary filmmakers, and we're filming it ourselves, they're following him around, and you may hear a little bit about it from the Secretary. There's a previous documentary about him, Inequality for All, that's pretty well known, and this may become pretty well known, so you all may be stars later on. He was born in Scranton, PA. His father owned a women's clothing store. He went to college at Dartmouth, where it is rumored that he had a date with a woman named Hillary Rodham. He went to Yale Law School, where he did know Bill and Hillary quite well, and was also a classmate of Clarence Thomas. Think about that for a minute. I was an undergraduate at Yale at the time, and I have pictures, and that's why he's here tonight. He's taught at the Kennedy School at Harvard. He's worked for 3 administrations in prominent positions, chairs Common Cause, run for governor of Massachusetts, played hardball with Chris Matthews, and is the chancellor's professor at the Goldman School at the University of California at Berkeley, and an eloquent voice for people who need an eloquent voice. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Reich.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. What a pleasure to be here. Wonderful, wonderful library and Rainy Day Books. Thank you so much for sponsoring this. And I'm here primarily to sell a book, but also to speak to you about what's inside the book. I'm not really a salesperson. I really am interested in ideas, and writing a book is a vehicle for talking about ideas. But please buy my book too. Actually, I was just upstairs with a bunch of people who couldn't get in to Right Now, and they are the people who are left out. They're my heroes. Talking about inequality, you upstairs, go for it. I'll tell you, the name of the book is Saving Capitalism, for the Many, Not the Few. And I've been just about 5 or 6 days talking to people about the book, and I've got 2 kind of reactions just to the title. One group of people says to me, saving capitalism, wait a minute, that implies that there's something wrong with capitalism. Why do you think there's something wrong with capitalism? It's a perfect system. And then the other group of people says to me, saving capitalism, it sounds like you want to save a system that shouldn't be saved. And so I can't win either way. It's a perfectly awful title because it antagonizes everyone, but actually that's the right title because I want to get people thinking and upset a little bit. The subtitle is, in some senses, more important, and that is for the many, not the few. Because sometimes we get a little bit, well, we get very partisan. Have you noticed that? It doesn't happen in Kansas City, I know that. But elsewhere around the country, there is a kind of a partisan edge, and sometimes we get angry and we don't speak to each other, and we consider ourselves either on one side or the other side. And one of the purposes I had in writing this and coming out and talking about the ideas in the book is to get us to talk to each other again. I'm going to come back to this point, but it's really very, very central and very, very important. The book is built around three basic mythologies that I think have to be busted before we can actually talk to one another across whatever divides there are. And mythology number one, and this is very important, is that there is something called a free market that exists separately from something called government, and that we have to choose between the two. Some people in this choice say, well, I don't trust the market, I really trust government, and other people say, well, I don't trust government, I trust the market, and we get into this almost endless debate about which do you trust more or less. Sometimes when I am engaged in a public debate with somebody who calls himself or herself a conservative or a libertarian or a Republican or whatever, no matter what we're talking about, it doesn't matter. We can be talking about any issue in the world. Within 4 minutes, the question becomes, well, do you trust the market or do you trust government? I had a debate with Newt Gingrich not too long ago. Now, you see, you just had a reaction. And we had a very good debate, but it degenerated, I want to say degenerated advisedly, very quickly into who do you trust more or who do you trust less. What I want to suggest to you is that you cannot have a market without rules. In other words, in the state of nature, there is not a market, it's just a survival of the fittest, the biggest, the heaviest, the most powerful. In civilization, in a real market, you have rules. And those rules come from somewhere. They're not kind of abstract, inevitable market forces that nobody can control. Those rules come from courts, or from legislatures, or Congress, or state legislatures, or they come from administrative agencies. There are always rules. And those rules are basically created by government. So the question is not do you like government versus market, the question is the system, this political economic system, working for the vast majority, or is it working for a small minority? That's the real issue. And that's what we're not debating, or nearly enough. We're taking sides in a debate that is a false debate. I mean, you're going to have a baseball game playoffs next week, right? I mean, I was passing a fountain not long ago around here, and it was blue. I said, I've never seen a blue fountain before. But can you imagine, just for the sake of the argument, can you imagine if you regarded baseball as sort of a free market, competition, free market, winner does the best, but there weren't rules? Well, that would be absurd. And the rules have got to be fair in the sense that if the rules were loaded in some way, or the game was rigged in some way, or we all knew that it was not possible for the Royals to actually win because no, Houston or somebody else would have stacked the deck, well, that we wouldn't even want to see the game. I mean, there would be no point in having a game. You get my drift? Rules are necessities. Those rules come from government, and the real question is, who controls the rules? In whose interest are the rules being made? So that's kind of point number one. That's mythology number one. We need to get rid of that mythology so we can actually have a very constructive discussion. Now, there is a second mythology that comes out of the first mythology. And that second mythology is also a conversation stopper. That second mythology is that we are paid what we're worth. Have you heard that one? Some of you laugh. No, but I mean it. I mean, there's a tautology. Obviously, we're paid what we're worth in the market because we're paid what we are worth in the market. That is, we earn what we're worth, whatever the market dictates we are worth. But that just gets you around and around and around. That doesn't tell you anything. When somebody says you're paid what you're worth, what they really are making is not a tautological statement. They're really making a moral claim. They're making a claim about what you should be earning. They're making a moral justification about what you are earning or anybody else is earning. So if you have, for example, a hedge fund manager who is taking home $1 billion a year, somebody who believes that we're paid what we're worth would say, well, the hedge fund manager must be worth in some moral sense, not in the tautological sense, but in the moral sense, must be worth $1 billion that year. Because after all, that's what the market awarded him, and the market must be just. There's the rub. Because if you understand principle number one, that the market is created by rules, and the question is necessarily, are those rules fair? Well, if those rules may not be fair, if there's a moral question about the moral justification of those rules, then you cannot go to principle number two and say necessarily the hedge fund manager in any realistic moral sense is worth $1 billion a year, because if the market is morally unjustifiable, then the market is not, in a morally important way, deciding what people are morally or socially worth. In fact, it's interesting to me, just to connect those two principles, we've got all kinds of rules. One rule that I was investigating not too long ago, in fact, you see it in the book, is a rule that says that confidential insider information can be used by traders on Wall Street. And they can be used in the following way. If I'm a CEO, let's say I'm a CEO of a big company, and I know that tomorrow my company is going to do something that is going to dramatically affect the stock price. Now that's confidential because I know, but nobody else knows, or maybe a few people who work for me know, and none of us are permitted to trade on that insider information. But supposing I tell my golfing buddy, and my golfing buddy then goes over to his favorite, or calls his favorite hedge fund manager, and that hedge fund manager makes a huge bet on what happens to the company, and the next day the bet turns out to be a winning bet, obviously because it was based on confidential information. Well, in America right now, that is not considered to be illegal. That's legal. In most other countries, that would be illegal. That would be a fraud. That would be a contractual fraud. In this country, it is legal. Now, follow me from myth number one to myth number two about hedge fund managers or everybody else earning and deserving what they earn. You see the problem. If that hedge fund manager is trading on insider information, then why do we suppose that hedge fund manager is worth $1 billion if trading on insider information makes us feel uncomfortable, is sort of morally suspect in some way? You understand, follow what I'm saying? I'm trying to read your body language. And then we get, very quickly, to mythology number three, which again follows from the first two. And that third mythology is that the biggest issue that divides liberals and conservatives, besides the size of government or whether you choose government over the market, the next biggest issue is whether you tax people at the top and redistribute, or how much you tax and redistribute. The problem with focusing on that only is that it tends to take our attention away from all of the ways in which the market is pre-distributing income and wealth upward. Now, what do I mean by that? Let me explain. you and I and everybody else in this country pays more for pharmaceuticals than any citizens of any advanced nation. Now, why do we pay more for pharmaceuticals? Well, we pay more for pharmaceuticals because it's not that the market, some abstract market forces, I mean, other people don't pay as much as we do. So there must be something specifically going on here. And it turns out that it has to do with the way in which pharmaceutical companies have got laws and rules that protect them. For example, in the United States, it's perfectly legal for a pharmaceutical company that has a patent, just as the patent is about to expire, that pharmaceutical company can pay a generic manufacturer who would otherwise come up with a cheaper version of the proprietary product to delay introducing that generic version. It's called pay for delay. Now, that's illegal in most other countries. Pay for delay is illegal. In the United States, it's legal. Why is it legal? It may have something to do with the political power of the pharmaceutical industry. You also, some of you may know, you can no longer buy your drugs from Canada. You could, but you can no longer do that legally. That also tends to raise the price. Another thing that tends to raise the price is that the government in the United States cannot use Medicare, the huge bargaining power that comes with Medicare, to negotiate lower drug prices from the pharmaceutical industry. So, and I could go on and on and on and bore you silly with ways in which the pharmaceutical industry has made sure that you pay more. But that's an upward pre-distribution. That means more is coming out of your paychecks to go for all the medications you have. That is money going from you to pharmaceutical corporations, to executives, to big shareholders. Or take internet service. You take internet service, I'll take internet service. I don't know how it is in Kansas City, but most Americans are paying more for internet service than any other rich country. Now, why is that? And by the way, we also have slower internet service than almost anybody else. Now, you would think that, I mean, didn't we invent the internet or something? That's what Al Gore said, or maybe he said he invented the internet, I don't know. But here's what's confusing. Why is it that we pay so much? Could it be that the internet service providers, the cable companies, have a lot of political power to limit competition? In fact, 80% of Americans have no choice of internet service provider. And if you have no choice, that means that the internet service providers can basically charge you whatever the market will bear, and that means you're going to pay more. This is basic economics, and that means it's a pre-distribution. Again, I'm using the word pre-distribution because it's inside the market. It's not a redistribution after the market. It's a pre-distribution that's hidden inside the market. And we could go on, industry after industry. I mean, other industries that I'm fascinated by, banking. You're in favor. I mean, here's the thing. The 5 biggest banks on Wall Street. Back in the 1990s, when I originally started thinking about these things and looking at these things, the 5 biggest banks on Wall Street held about 10% of all banking assets in the United States. Now, fast forward to 2007, this is just a year before the crash and the bailout. In 2007, the 5 biggest banks on Wall Street held 25% of all banking assets. Now, 2015, the 5 biggest banks on Wall Street hold 44% of all banking assets. In other words, they're huge. And that gives them huge market power, and that also gives them huge political power. And And that political power is being exercised in all kinds of ways to tilt the market in their direction, charge us more, a predistribution upward. But you see, all these predistributions, we don't pay attention because we don't really see them. We don't know about them. Nobody's talking about them. All we're talking about is, do you think government or market? Or do you think you ought to tax and redistribute? But we're not talking about the pre-distributions inside the market. Bankruptcy. Now, bankruptcy law and the bankruptcy code, you probably don't spend a lot of time going over the bankruptcy code, do you? In your spare time, if you can't get to sleep, I would recommend it. It's better than Salmonex. There is no after effect. But let me just tell you something about bankruptcy that I have been following, but it's part of a large mosaic. If you're a big company or if you're a billionaire, you can use bankruptcy to protect your assets if you make a bad bet. In fact, there's at least one presidential candidate who's going to... This is a nonpartisan discussion, and I will not finish that sentence. All right, there's one presidential candidate who's gone into bankruptcy 4 times. But the bankruptcy code, over time, has been changed and altered slightly, quietly, so that it's easier and easier for big corporations to use bankruptcy. For example, a big airline that wants to get out of its labor contracts can do it and has done it, most airlines, by going into bankruptcy and then coming out again and having no labor contract. But if you are a homeowner and you get caught in the downdraft of a big recession, and suddenly your house is worth less than you paid for it and what you owe on it, can you use bankruptcy to reorganize your mortgage debt if you can't pay? The answer is no. Or if you are a student debtor or somebody who is 30 years or 40 years or 50 years after you've graduated, you still have student debt and you're still burdened by a big student debt, can you use bankruptcy to reorganize your student debt? No. Because the student debt industry, like the credit card industry, like the big banks, have used their political power to change the bankruptcy code in ways that make it harder for you and easier for the big companies and the big banks. You get my drift. We've got a problem here. And the problem has to do with how hidden so much of this actually is. Now, we talk a lot about inequality. And I've written about inequality, and you've read about inequality, and inequality almost becomes a partisan issue. But what has happened is, over the last 30 years, the median wage in the United States has barely risen, adjusted for inflation. When I say median, by the way, I am distinguishing between median and average. You don't need to know the difference. The basketball player Shaquille O'Neal and I have an average height of 6'1". You see, people at the top bring up the average. But when you talk about median, you're talking about somebody smack in the middle, 50% above, 50% below. So the median wage is a much better indicator of people's wages than average. The median wage, since the late 70s, have basically stagnated. If you're in the bottom 90%, the median wages actually dropped. Even though the United States economy is almost twice as large as it was in 1980. Now, what's going on? When I start talking about this, and I suggest to people that we've got a fundamental problem here, some people accuse me of being a class warrior. I'm not a class warrior. I'm a class worrier. Do you get the difference? I'm worried. I am worried in the following respect. I'm worried, number one, because if you don't have a large and growing middle class and working class and poor people who can ascend into the middle class, you don't have as much purchasing power as you need to keep the economy going. It's as simple as that. One of the reasons we have had such an anemic recovery, and this recovery has been among the most anemic recoveries we've ever had, one reason is there's not enough what's called aggregate demand to keep the economy going. Why? Because almost all the gains have gone to the very top. This is not criticizing the people at the top. This is a matter of understanding what has happened to the economy. People sometimes think that the job creators are the CEOs and the big corporations. They are not the job creators. The job creators are people in the middle and below who have more money in their pockets, and that is critically important. But when I say this, and you applaud, I worry, because I don't want this to be a partisan issue. This is not and should not be. And I want you to understand something that is really very essential. And let's talk about an issue that is a little touchy, a little tricky, and that is the minimum wage. Now, if you followed my argument so far, that the market is not this kind of abstract thing that exists in nature, but it is a human creation, that what we earn is not necessarily what we deserve or what we are worth, but it is really a matter of how the market is organized, and that inside the market there are all of these pre-distributions upward, then what happens when you raise the minimum wage? Well, you can raise the minimum wage, put more money in people's pockets, they turn around and buy more, and that creates jobs. It's not destroying jobs, it is creating jobs. It should not be a partisan issue. In 1996, I was Secretary of Labor, and I thought, we hadn't raised the minimum wage nationally, federally, in years. And I went to Bill Clinton, and I said, well, we ought to do it. And he said, well, that's probably right. Why don't you check with Dick Morris? Do you remember Dick Morris? He's a terrible person. I shouldn't. No, I don't mean that. He's a perfectly fine. Well, no, he's terrible. But I said to Dick Morris, who was then the pollster for Bill Clinton, I said, Can you do a poll on the minimum wage? Just see how many people are in favor of the minimum wage increase. And the next morning, he came back and said, I can't believe it. 85% of Americans think the minimum wage ought to be increased. And he told Bill Clinton, and then we went to the Capitol Hill, and even though the Republicans were in control of both houses, we did raise the minimum wage in 1996 because there was overwhelming support for a minimum wage increase. And by the way, to this day, I don't know how Dick Morris does his polls so quickly. I think he polls his family. I think that's what happens. But you see, there is even now support for a minimum wage increase, and what research shows us around the country is that you can raise the minimum wage not to $20 or $30 or $40 an hour, but you can raise it to $13, $14, $15 an hour and it's not going to have a negative effect on employment because, again, it puts more money into people's pockets, and they spend it, and that creates jobs. And we know that. Because after 1996, when we raised the minimum wage, a significant amount, percentage-wise, we didn't lose jobs. In fact, after the minimum wage was raised, during the next 5 years, 22 million net new jobs were created. 22 million. I was Secretary of Labor at the time, and I created every one of them. Thank you. But you see, we can have a discussion, and we need to have a discussion across partisan lines, and we ought to have a discussion that is based in empirical reality and not in ideology. The economy is not working for most people. When I say saving capitalism, I'm simply saying that most people are losing hope. I go through airports very often, and people I don't know, I think it's because I am so conspicuous. People I don't know come up to me. And in fact, it happened just a few days ago on this book tour. They come up to me and they say things that suggest that we've known each other or been in contact for years, completely strange people. This lovely lady, very nice person, I was walking along carrying my, kind of taking my briefcase and my roller behind me, and she stopped me and she said, "What are we going to do?" I didn't know whether she was talking to me. I said, "Excuse me?" She said, "What are we going to do?" I said, "I don't know." I had another person a few weeks ago in an airport come up to me. Again, he was walking by my side. I said, "Hello." He said, "Can you believe it?" "Can you believe it?" He said, "Can you believe it?" I said, "Well, what?" But you see, it's happened and it's happening more often, and I sort of understand it. It's like being in a free-floating focus group. Because what people are really doing when they're coming up to me is they're expressing a kind of combination of fear and exasperation and anxiety and worry. And if you look at the polls, you see the same thing. A lot of people, again, regardless of their political party, regardless of whether they call themselves liberals or conservatives, what they feel is that somehow the system is not working for them any longer. And when they think about the system, they don't draw a rigid distinction between the economy and politics. It's just all sort of not working. We're sort of off track somehow. Now, people have different theories about why we're off track, and they have different views about that, but there is a huge and growing number of people who say something is wrong. And it's that sentiment that something is wrong that I think is hugely important in terms of beginning a national discussion that is no longer as strident and as partisan as we have had. A couple of weeks ago, I was on a television talk show, a debate, with an economist who had been the chief economist for John McCain in the election 2008, I believe, when John McCain was running for president. And it turned out, we were talking about a variety of issues, national debt and the deficit and all kinds of things, and it turned out he and I agreed on just about everything that came up. And he was amazed, and I was kind of surprised. And we were talking 6 or 7 minutes, and then there was a station break, and the producer in my earbud came on, and I said, "What do you think? Pretty good, isn't it?" She said, "No, no, no, no. You have to be angrier." I said, "What do you mean? Isn't it amazing and wonderful that here we have a Republican economic advisor and me, and we're agreeing and we're demonstrating to the public how much agreement there actually is? That's not good." And she said, "No, no, it's bad." I said, "Why is it bad?" Because, she said, you have millions of people who are surfing through hundreds of channels, and they stop when they see yelling. They stop when they see kind of a gladiator contest. And I said, "That can't be right." She said, "Yes, it is. We know it." I said, "Well, I don't want to yell. I don't want to scream. I don't want to be angry." She said, "You must." I said, "No, I don't want to." She said, "We have 5 seconds left before we go back on the air." I said, "I don't want to." She said, "You must." And at that point, I lost my temper. With her. But I think that one reason that you have so much anger out there, which is reflected in the media, but it is only reflected, I think one reason is that you've got so many people who are so insecure and so scared and so worried. For the first time in living memory, according to the polls, we have a majority of Americans believing that their children are not going to live as well as they are living. And we have huge numbers of people who are working harder than ever and not getting anywhere. There is a group of people, when I was growing up, by the way, I grew up in a farm community about 60 miles north of New York State. My father had a dress shop, and it was dresses basically for the wives of factory workers, and we were not wealthy. We were modest income. In fact, we were sort of, now that I think back on it, lower middle class. But we could, and he could, support our family with one wage earner, and we had 2 cars, and we were one of the first people in our neighborhood to get a television set. I don't know how many of you probably don't remember, but in those days, the first television sets, you know, they were little bitchy things you could almost not see. They were little round, and all the neighbors came over. But I had no sense, and we had no sense of being insecure. I mean, it was tough going, and he was working very hard, and then my mother joined him, but we could still make ends meet very, very easily. Today, it takes 2 wage earners, and it's very hard for people to get by. In those days, in the 1950s and 60s, the typical CEO, Chief Executive Officer of the typical corporation, was earning 20 times what the average worker was earning. Now, the CEO of the typical big company in America is earning 300 times what the typical worker is earning. In those days, in the 1950s, and I don't mean to say everything was good then, because there was a lot wrong with the 1950s and 60s, but in the 1950s and 60s, when I was growing up, we had a bank in town. We had a couple of banks, and they made loans. They made a loan to my dad when he was really in need, and that loan might not have been all that wise according to the normal banking criteria, but the banker who was making the loan knew that my father was a good credit risk and knew him and knew my mother, and we had a place in the community, and it was kind of like, Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life. But now that bank is gone, and instead of that local bank, we have a branch office of Wells Fargo or Bank of America or some other big national global bank. In other words, without painting a picture that was too rosy, things seemed to be on track. As the economy grew in the 1950s, everybody's income seemed to be going up. Now, it is true, women and blacks and the Latinos we had were not on that same track, at least not yet, but we fought very hard. The civil rights movement, for voting rights and civil rights, and then we tried very hard to reduce poverty among the elderly. We had Medicare in 1965 and Medicaid, and then in 1970, under Richard Nixon, the Environmental Protection Act. And we were working hard. I remember that. My first job in Washington in 1967 was as an assistant, intern really, for Robert F. Kennedy. And it was a marvelous, exciting job. I mean, Washington was kind of a seedy place then, not all that money flowing into Washington, but I had a job. My job for Robert F. Kennedy was running his signature machine. Now, a signature machine in those days, you had a pen on the end of a big wooden kind of arm that moved according to a groove in a piece of, well, it was just a kind of piece of wood, and you turned it on, and the pen, if you did it right, and you had everything lined up, you had to line everything. That was my job, line it up perfectly, and then it went Robert F. Kennedy, and every day I'd have a huge stack of letters typed by the typing pool on Robert F. Kennedy's Senate stationery, going to all kinds of constituents who had written in, and I would make sure that everything was perfectly fine and lined up. But then I got bored. I frankly, it was not as exciting as it sounds. And about 2 months in, I decided to go into the office. This was not, keep it in this room if you can, and I went into the office and I typed on Senator Robert F. Kennedy's stationery, I typed letters to my friends. Dear Mr. Dworkin, congratulations on having the largest nose in New York State, Robert F. Kennedy. And I put it in, and my friends still have these things. It's plastered on their walls. And then one day I was standing outside the elevators in the Senate office building, and out from the elevator came Senator Robert F. Kennedy. Now, I was an intern. I hadn't actually seen the senator, and I was dumbstruck. I thought, he is the person whose signature I put on everything every day. And he looked at me for an instant, and he was surrounded by his aides, and they were talking about big, important national whatever. And he looked at me and he said, "How's the summer going, Bob?" He knew my name. And I was flabbergasted. My mouth opened and I could barely get the words out of my mouth. But had he asked me to run his signature machine for the next 3 years, on the basis of that, I would have easily done it. Washington was an exciting and inspiring place. And the thing that I also remember is that Republicans and Democrats worked together. There was a camaraderie, there was a sense of mission, not on everything, there were disagreements, but at least we worked together on important issues. Now, I have been in and out of government since then, several times. My next job in government, by the way, was working in the Ford administration. And my boss in the Ford administration was Robert Bork. I was in the Solicitor General's office, and I was charged with writing briefs representing the United States and occasionally arguing before the Supreme Court. And my boss was Robert Bork, and we had a good time. I had enormous respect for him. We disagreed on the First, Second, Fourth, Fifth, Eighth, and Ninth Amendments. But other than that, it was a friendly disagreement. It was a respectful, can I just say this, a respectful disagreement. And we had good discussions. And I admired his mind. And then I worked in the Carter administration, and then I went back and did some teaching, and I came back as Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton. But I noticed a change. There were two big changes in Washington over these years. One big change was that Washington went from being kind of a seedy place to a rich, emerald city. When I started in Washington, there were grubby restaurants with cockroaches, and I mean, it was rather awful, but I didn't care. But by the time I was Secretary of Labor, Washington restaurants were extraordinary. They were beautiful, and they were rich. Heavy plates and heavy silverware and heavy napkins. And I also noticed something else, and that is, in Washington, partisanship and anger became the rule of the town. No longer did people talk to each other as they had talked before. It was kind of shocking. One day I came back from being out, and I think I had testified on Capitol Hill. I came back to my office in the Labor Department, and there were all bunch of young people. They were young, mostly men, and they were going through my files. And I said, "Excuse me, I'm sorry, are you going through my files?" They said, "Yes." I said, "Well, why?" And they said, "We're looking for something." I said, "Well, can I help?" And they said, "No, I said, "What are you looking for?" And then one of my aides came up to me and said, "Mr. Secretary, so sorry, we tried to reach you. They're looking for evidence that you did something wrong." I said, "But I didn't do something wrong." And my aide said, "But they're looking for evidence that you did." Washington became a place where a friend was somebody who stabbed you in the front. We've got to stop this. I tell my students, that the way in which you learn something is to get out of your bubble and talk to somebody who disagrees with you. That's the only way to learn. And maybe you'll learn and maybe they will learn. In terms of the economy and in terms of politics and in terms of some of the biggest problems we have talked about, I've talked about tonight, what do? Well, we create countervailing power. That is, people join with other people. We are in the majority. We put aside ideology and we get on with the practical goal of gaining back control over our economy and our democracy. And it's not that hard. Last few days I've been in the heartland and I've talked to family farmers. Yesterday I had a wonderful discussion with a bunch of family farmers in central Missouri, and they were telling me what they were doing and what they're trying to do, and they were having a hard time of it because of factory farms and because of, they said, big monopolists that were basically taking all the money out of their communities and leaving them with very slim margins, and they needed to work with others, and they felt like they were only going to have political power if they joined together themselves and joined with others. And this morning I had a wonderful opportunity to talk with the faith-based community and people who were trying to raise the minimum wage, and they had succeeded here, but they were worried that the state legislature was going to take away what they had done. And some of the people were even small business people. And I said, well, small business people, wait a minute, small business people are supposed to be not like the minimum wage increase, but it turns out that some of the small business people are being squeezed by big business. In fact, I heard from some of the small business people the same story I heard from the small farmers, and even the same story I heard from some of the working people. Do you see where I'm going? We have allowed our democracy to be hijacked. And I don't mean to blame big corporations and CEOs and Wall Street and Wall Street traders and hedge fund managers and billionaires. They are doing what they would ordinarily do to maximize their profits and maximize their income, and they understand that one way of doing that is to get favorable rules. I blame all the rest of us because we have allowed ourselves to be divided. Divided by race and ethnicity and religion. And we have allowed ourselves to lose track of the big picture that we all depend on. Some of my students, they are so publicly spirited, but they worry about politics. They look cynically upon politics. People ask me how I maintain my optimism. Why are you optimistic, they say to me, because, you know, I've been in and out of politics for years, and I've been writing, I've been watching what has happened over the last 40 years to incomes, to what's happening to Americans, and I've seen the partisanship. How, they say to me, can you be optimistic? And I say to them, there are three major reasons why I am optimistic, and you should be too. Reason number one is that if you look back in American history, you see again and again, in the 1830s, and again between 1901 and 1916, the Progressive Era, and then in the 1930s, the New Deal, and then to some extent in the 1960s, you see people reforming the system from the grassroots up. When we understand the nature of a problem and the system is getting off track, we put ideology aside and we roll up our sleeves. Some other countries, and you saw this in the 1930s, some other countries succumb to fascism or totalitarianism, or before that in Russia to communism or some other ism. We don't do that. We reform our system. We've done it again and again, and we will do it again, because what's happening now is unsustainable. What's happening to our democracy and what's happening to our economy. All that money, all that wealth going to the top, and that infecting and corroding and undermining our democracy and changing the rules of the game to help the people at the top. You see how that is a vicious cycle, and it can't be allowed to continue. So that's one source of optimism. We've done it before. We will reform again. The second source of optimism is when I'm not in Washington, I have taught. I have taught now generations of students. I had a student come to me recently. He said, "My mother told me to take your class." I said, "Am I that old?" I could barely stand up when she said that. But I have been teaching since 1981, and I have taught many, many students, and the current young people between the ages of 18 and 25 are the most idealistic and energetic and positive I have ever encountered. Now, as I said, they are, yes, you can applaud on that. I think they deserve applause. They are cynical about government, but they are absolutely idealistic about public service and making the system better. But I tell them, if you're cynical about politics and government, then you are cynical about democracy. And if you're cynical about democracy, that is a self-fulfilling prophecy, because then you give up on it. And if you give up on it, then the moneyed interests win it all. And so we must not. And the third and final reason I'm optimistic is because I don't like the alternative. And neither should you. We have to get out of our bubbles. We're all in a bubble. We all talk to people who agree with us. I used to live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I was teaching at Harvard, and then in 2004, 2005, I got a job at Berkeley, the University of California, Berkeley. And so I went from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Berkeley, California. Now, they're separated by 3,000 miles, but they're actually the same town. The weather is better in the Berkeley part of the town, but there are two bubbles. You know, when I left Cambridge and went to Berkeley, I drove across the country. I love driving across the country. Have you driven across the country a lot of times? It's wonderful. I was driving in 2005 a Mini Cooper. Now, that was, I think, the first year that there were very Mini Coopers available, and I bought a Mini Cooper in Cambridge, and I drove it across the country, and I was in Oklahoma, that's right, I was in Oklahoma, and I did not see any other Mini Coopers. I think there were no Mini Coopers. Are there now Mini Coopers in the heartland? But there were no Mini Coopers in Oklahoma. And I stopped at a garage, and I just stopped to get some gas, actually, and I was inside the car, and these truckers, big truckers, came up to me, and they tapped on the window, and I lowered the window, and I was waiting for gas. I was in a gas line. And they said, "What is this?" I said, "It's a Mini Cooper." And they said, "How does anybody fit in there?" Well, I just opened the door, and I came out, and I said, "There's no problem at all." And they looked kind of puzzled, and I said, I'm from Massachusetts. We're all under 5 feet tall. But we've got to get out of our bubbles. And we've got to reach out, as I said, to people who disagree with us. We've got to talk about how to reorganize the economy for everyone, not just for a few. And that's what my book is about. And that's why I hope you buy it. A long-winded way of saying it. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. And now I really want to take your questions, and there are 2 microphones here, and I'll go back and forth. And I will repeat the question so everybody can hear if you can't hear it. And if I don't know the answer to your question, I'll just repeat a question that I can answer.
Thank you for coming tonight. It's very nice. I've noticed that MoveOn.org has sponsored you. You're now a voice of MoveOn.org. We have a Johnson County Move On Council here tonight. Why did you have MoveOn.org behind you, and why are you the voice of MoveOn.org at times?
I don't know. I mean, I started to. I have two sons. One of them is an academic. The other is in showbiz, or is in Los Angeles. And my showbiz son said to me about 4 years ago, he said, "Dad, you know, I admire the fact that you're writing books, but nobody reads books anymore. And if you want to really get to my generation, you have to make movies and videos." And then I was depressed for about 2 months. And then I decided, well, I can do both. I can write books, but I can also do movies and videos. But then, of course, the problem is, who's going to pay for the videos? And Move On said, we'd be happy to pay for the videos, and that's really how that happened.
Great 12. Great 12.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
I'm from Kansas, and I'm sure you've heard about Governor Sam Brownback, who has basically destroyed the Kansas economy by cutting taxes on pass-through income for the most part, and who's doubling down, tripling down on trickle-down economics, which he had 2 years ago or so met with Arthur Laffer and totally believes in the Arthur Laffer trickle-down economics model, which doesn't really work. So what would you say if you're trying to avoid being getting locked into the typical argument of government and or private capital and Democrat and Republican? How can you explain to someone like Governor Sam Brownback your ideas to maybe make an impact?
Okay, so you're asking, how would I explain to Governor Sam Brownback my ideas?
Yes.
And you said that he's influenced by Arthur Laffer, who's actually a very good friend. I like Arthur, and we debate a lot, and I admire him a great deal. He's wrong about most things, but I like him. So you be Governor Brownback, okay? All right.
No, I don't want to.
Yeah, you be him. You brought him up, you're a governor. So I'll say, Governor, how are you? Good. Governor, you've cut taxes, and I understand you believe in this kind of trickle-down economics, but, you know, it hasn't really worked, has it? I mean, let's just between us. This is not public. It's just, you know, that Kansas is in terrible...
Brownback, it's still going to work. I'm waiting for it to happen.
Oh, you're waiting for it.
It's gonna happen.
But Governor, can I call you Sam? Governor, it's been a long time. I mean, in kind of economic history, the rest of the country had something of a recovery, not a huge one, but Kansas is really in the pits. I mean, not to put it too bluntly. But you know, I'm from California, and we actually raise taxes, and California's economy is booming. So maybe, again, I don't want to be harsh, Governor, but you ought to think through that trickle-down economics, or tax cuts on people at the top and big corporations, may not be the way to run your economy, because the big corporations and the CEOs are not the job creators. The job creators are the people in the middle class and the working class and the poor who have money to actually spend and therefore create incentives for businesses to create jobs. And by the way, we have had a lot of trickle-down economic tax cuts for people at the top. And Governor, I'm sorry to say this, nothing has trickled down. Nothing. So Governor, I have a copy of my book. I want you to... Just read it and we'll talk later, okay? Go.
I have a question about some of the information that the NSA collects on everyone. I've heard that it may be ending up in the hands of some leaders of some of the corporations to gain market shares overseas?
Now you're talking about who collects, I'm sorry,
I believe it's the National Security Agency. I'm not sure which government agency, but I've heard that some of the information actually ends up in the hands of corporate leaders and that they use this information overseas to gain market share.
Well, I have not heard that. I mean, I think that there's a real problem with privacy and the NSA gathering all of this information. And I don't like it, and I feel personally invaded, and I don't like all the hacking that's going on. But your point that they're using it to gain market share, I've never heard before. I'll look into it. Thank you.
What I'm wondering is how that would affect our relations with other countries. It would seem to me like if that is true, that it could really damage our future.
Well, it's not going to be helpful. I mean, I don't think it was particularly helpful when it turned out, and we learned from leaks, that even prime ministers were being hacked by the NSA. I mean, if I were a prime minister of another country and I found out the United States government was hacking my phone and I'm an ally of the United States, I'd be a little bit pissed off. So I don't think it really helps foreign policy, if that's what you're getting at. I think you're absolutely right. Yes?
You described that politics is cyclical and that we need to reinvent ourselves, say, every 30 years or whatever the time frame is. Have we reached a point in our political consensus that we are all just so fed up that it's time for a revolution and it's time for a change? And if so, do you see those signs of change out there? And when do we reach that tipping point that finally we're going to get some reality in our lives?
Well, I do see signs of change out there. And let me tell you, let me use a historical analogy, and that is in the 1890s, a politician named William Jennings Bryan, the prairie populist, started to react against the domination of politics and our democracy, and certainly the entire Middle West, by the banks, by the big corporations. Now, William Jennings Bryan was called a populist, and his ideas did not take hold. He didn't win the election, but in 1901, a Republican named Teddy Roosevelt became president quite unexpectedly, and many of the populist ideas that William Jennings Bryan had been put forward actually became law under the guise of a Republican administration, under a progressive administration. You see, there are these great waves, and you don't know exactly when the tipping point is coming. How can you tell? Well, one thing you can tell that gives it away is when you see a kind of a politics of populism beginning to rise again. How do you know that it's starting to rise again? Well, one thing that's a giveaway is when the so-called ruling class, the establishment Washington insiders, find that their candidates are not making it as they expected. Now, again, I don't want to talk about any particular candidate. But in the Republican Party, you've got somebody who looks like an outsider, and you've got in the Democratic Party somebody who looks like an outsider, even though he has been an insider. But don't pay any attention to anybody else. But here's what's interesting to me, and let me talk about this for just a moment, because populism has two faces. One face is the progressive reform populism of the sort that we had between 1901 and 1916. The other face of populism is really authoritarian populism, where people rise up and they follow a strong man who says, forget about democracy, forget about the details, just follow me because I am tough and strong and powerful, and I'm going to make everything right. And by the way, the problems you're suffering is because of them. Kind of find scapegoats. Now again, I'm not going to suggest that there are any candidates that resemble either the progressive populist tradition or the authoritarian populist tradition, but what is interesting to me is that you see evidence of both bubbling to the surface. You get my drift?
Now, if asked to serve, would you go back into Beltway politics? And when do you announce your candidacy?
Well, let's put it this way. If any president asked me to serve, I would feel duty-bound to do it, as you would, and anybody in this room would have to. I mean, that's what you do. It is your duty as a citizen. I would do it. I don't think I would do it with my tail wagging and my heart fluttering like I did in the 1990s, because I've kind of been there and done that, but of course I would do that. Yes.
If we had acted or were to act on Franklin Roosevelt's Second Bill of Rights and the Employment Act of 1946 and guarantee an employment at a living wage for every member of our society, could we let the too big to fail organizations fail? And would that reduce this inequality of wealth?
Well, the too big to fail organizations are now mainly Wall Street banks. There are some big, big corporations as well. We can't allow them to remain too big to fail. I really do believe that it's important to bust up the big Wall Street banks, or at least set limits to how big they can grow. And I don't mean, I didn't mean, and I don't want this particular discussion to be about particular policies, because particular policies are easy to talk about. What's hard is to get the politics and the social movement and the people organized and mobilized to do that. You talked about Franklin D. Roosevelt. Well, Franklin D. Roosevelt, you may not know this, and I came across this incident by accident. In 1936, when he was running for re-election, a woman came up to him and said, "Mr. President, I am willing to vote for you, but you must do this and this and this and this and this." She had a whole list of things that she wanted, and it turned out he actually supported every one of those. And he said, "Ma'am, if I'm reelected, I want to do everything you just listed, but if I'm reelected, you must make me." Now, what did he mean by "you must make me"? He meant, and this is something that I learned when I was in Washington, and I keep relearning it every time I go to Washington, you can have the best people in Washington. You can have public servants that really care, but unless there are good people outside Washington who are mobilized and organized and energized to push the good people inside Washington to do what's right, it doesn't get done, because the moneyed interests and the status quo interests will squelch it. And so, yes, the Second Bill of Rights, the Economic Bill of Rights, all these things are good, and public policies that we like are good, and it's nice to talk about them and cheer about them, but it means nothing unless we, the people, are mobilized and organized.
So our best hope is just to support Bernie Sanders.
Yes.
Thank you for coming out tonight, and I'm just curious what your opinion is on the Supreme Court case of Citizens United.
Well, there have been in history a bunch of very bad Supreme Court cases. There's the Dred Scott decision. There are a number of decisions that have set the country back in a variety of ways, and then there's Citizens United. I would say it's probably in my list of the 3 worst Supreme Court decisions of all time. Now, the question is, what do you do about it? Because you've got 5 members of the Supreme Court who voted for it. Now, one thing you might do is think back, if you remember history, to the late 1930s. You had a Supreme Court where 5 members were voting against the constitutionality of a lot of New Deal measures, and they were throwing them out. And then one of those 5, not because of political pressure, I think it's wrong to think that FDR's court-packing scheme had any effect, because this one of the 5 changed his mind before the court-packing scheme and came over to the other side. And ironically, his last name was Roberts. Coincidence. So one way of doing that is just to hope that one of those 5 sees the light, sees that they made a terrible mistake. Another way to do that is to make sure that whoever is elected president will appoint Supreme Court justices who want and are committed to reversing Citizens United. Thank you.
Yes, sir. My father served in the Department of Labor for about 25 years, shortly before you took over as Department of Labor Secretary. And he'd come to the dinner table and always said that the Department of Labor was mistreated and looked at like kind of like Cinderella before she went to the ball and got the tip end of everything else. And he was watching you on TV one time, and he says, I hope he's sticking up for the Department of Labor. And my question is, did you find when you were Secretary of Labor that the Department of Labor was, shall we say, looked upon with, that's the, you know, half of those guys are out of unions and everything. Their views aren't really that important and everything. Did you feel like you had to fight for the Department of Labor's position in government as a Secretary of Labor?
Well, I did not, in the sense that, remember, this was a Democratic administration, and it was Bill Clinton, and it was after 12 years of Republicans who did not like the Department of Labor very much. In fact, when I came in, almost every other labor secretary in history had had a big oil portrait done of him or her, and I looked for the oil portrait of Frances Perkins. Now, do you know who Frances Perkins was?
Secretary of Labor under Roosevelt.
Yes, for those of you who don't know, she was the first woman cabinet member. She was under Franklin D. Roosevelt, and she was almost singularly responsible for Social Security and unemployment insurance and workers' compensation and all of the things we now take for granted. She actually spearheaded all of that, and I looked for Frances Perkins, and I kept on saying, I would like Frances Perkins' portrait to be behind my desk. And everybody started looking for Frances Perkins, everybody in the department. I said, she must be here after 12 years. What did they do with Frances? And we found her in a closet. And she was peeling a little bit. And we restored her, and I put her up behind my desk. And she... look, I want to reemphasize something with you. In 1955, 35% of American workers belonged to a labor union. And that was enough percentage in the private sector to give American workers bargaining power to get a fair amount of the benefits of economic growth. Now in the private sector, fewer than 7% of workers are unionized, which means they don't have the bargaining power. And the non-union workers in the 1950s basically could count on the fact that unions were strong enough that they could get prevailing wages even in the non-unionized sector. That's no longer the case.
But doesn't that degrade the Department of Labor even in a Democratic administration, though?
Well, what I'm trying to say to you is that we all have an interest, not in the Department of Labor. Yes, I feel some loyalty to the department, but that's not the issue. The issue is working people in America have got to do better and have got to get more bargaining power. It's not just people who are unionized, it's people who are non-unionized, it's people who are working and they're poor. There should not be anybody who is working full-time and poor in America. You know, I talked this morning with a wonderful group. I mentioned it already, some people in the faith-based community and some people who were seeking a higher minimum wage and others. And we talked about the moral foundation of capitalism. Now, it may seem odd to you here to talk about the moral foundation of capitalism, but actually you need, and there are some very basic moral principles that we used to share, and I think most people in this country do share. That's why 85% of Americans, when Dick Morris asked them if he did, wanted to increase the minimum wage, not because they would benefit, but they thought it was unfair that people were working for so little. There is a moral sense in this country, not only that anybody who's working full-time should be out of poverty, but also that everybody, every child, every young person should have the opportunity to make the most of himself or herself. And we also have a moral sense that there should not be a permanent aristocracy of people who are powerful just simply because they are wealthy. This is not partisan. I talk to a lot of Republicans and a lot of conservatives, and they agree completely. This is not a partisan issue. We must get out of partisanship and share our moral ideals. Yes.
I was also going to ask you about your stance on labor unions in general, and where do you see your future?
I think, as I've suggested before, that unions were incredibly important in terms of giving the bargaining leverage to people. I think that unions are going to be even more important with regard to service workers in retail, restaurant, hotel, hospital, surface transportation, childcare, elder care, all of these areas. These people are not competing internationally directly. They are not competing with machinery and complicated, software. They need a union. If they had a union, they would have more bargaining leverage. They'd have more voice. A lot of these people need a voice. That's, again, a critical issue. Yeah.
Thank you very much for being here. I know one of your hats is to be a teacher. I'm a teacher as well, and just curious how you talk to your students in kind of this amoral time or time of, I guess, moral ambiguity, how to stay positive and stay optimistic and be leaders that can kind of lead us out of the mindset that we've fallen into.
Well, first of all, let me just remind you again that they are idealistic. They keep me idealistic. They keep me positive. Not long ago, I was meeting with a bunch of my students, and we were having lunch, and it was a great discussion, and they were talking about how they can make the country better and how they can cure some of the problems of the world, and we left this lunch place, and I was just charged up, and I saw, as we were leaving, the reflection of all of us in a shop window, and I saw these wonderful, beautiful, extraordinary young people, and in the middle of them was a little old man, and I didn't know for a moment who in the world had invaded our lunch. But to be serious, I think that they give me a lot of strength. And I think that young people are facing some much greater challenges economically than young people have done in previous generations. I think student debt is a huge problem for many of them. I think that the job market is hard. Many young people, even with college degrees, can't get good jobs, and many are putting off having families. They're living with their parents. This is not easy, and yet many of them have maintained their idealism and their excitement about the future. I just want to get them more involved in politics, and that's what I tell them over and over again. We have a couple of more questions, and we have one more question. And not a couple of more, we have one more question, and I don't want to put any pressure on you, but this better be a great question, because you don't have any, this is the last thing.
No idea, I have terrible anxiety.
You don't have it, don't worry, you have a book in your hand. I want to just see what book that is. I'm curious about the book that you have in your hand. Yes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I've been trying to think how to formulate it and make it, I guess, shorter. So I guess my big thing is, because we talk about partisan politics and how it becomes that way, and I really think it's more about ideological shifting and things. I mean, if you look at one of the great presidents of our time, Eisenhower, he was a moderate Republican from Kansas, but he would be probably considered very much the democratic socialist that people call Bernie Sanders. I mean, people would see them being very similar. He did a lot of social programs when he was president of the United States. I guess what I would like to ask is how we try to, I guess, educate people or help people when it comes to that terminology because of the misuse. I think that the media in some ways, by calling him the democratic socialist, is looking to hone in on that socialist aspect because people have a misunderstanding of what that really means. I mean, the Nazi Party was no more socialist than, you know, and I don't think we would say that the Democratic Republic of North Korea is a democracy. So talking about that, because there's countries like Norway and Finland and Sweden who have 90% voter turnout, who have great socialist democracies. They pay a lot of taxes. They have the highest happiness ratings in the world.
Can I don't mean to stop you, but I do mean to stop you.
No, stop me.
Because I want to just answer,
Yeah.
I think what your question is how do we get out of the kind of ideological straitjacket we are now in, when we used to have much more dialogue. You mentioned Eisenhower, you know, the marginal tax rate on the highest incomes under Dwight Eisenhower. Now I say marginal tax, that's the top tax on that marginal dollar, not every dollar, but just that top marginal dollar. Under Dwight Eisenhower, it was 91%. Now, I'm not suggesting that. That sounds crazy. But that was the 1950s, and that was Dwight Eisenhower, who was a Republican, and he was a former general, and he was a very lovely man. He was not very articulate. Does anybody remember Dwight Eisenhower? He sort of stumbled over his words, but it was in historical terms, he was a great president. But let me give you some confidence about something. About a week ago, I had a conversation with somebody who calls himself a Tea Partier. And we started talking, you know, at the high abstract level, and we were getting nowhere. And I said, well, what about, let's talk specifics. Do you think the Wall Street banks should be broken up? He said, yes. I said, do you think that we should get rid of corporate welfare? He said, absolutely. I said, do you think that we should oppose the Trans-Pacific Partnership? He said, of course. I said, do you think we should get big money out of politics? He said, absolutely. And I said, you and I are together. We are comrades. Not that way. I don't want to paint an overly rosy picture. I just simply mean that the kind of populist upsurge that we are now experiencing transcends the normal political divides. If we just listen more carefully to each other, we may discover that. Again, thank you all. Thank you.
For those of you who have books that they would like Secretary Rush to sign, would you line up starting over there and circling back through the auditorium? And the book is still for sale from our friends at Rainy Day.